right. We should now be live on Twitch. Here's hoping. This disembodied voice is Caitlin Cashin, your community manager. And today, Aisha and Marcy are going to show us how to make layouts with CSS. So, Aisha, take it away.
Awesome. Welcome, everybody. Glad to be back for another episode of Gatsby Gatsby Web Creators. That's what we're called. So today we are going to be talking about how to lay out our HTML pages. In previous episodes, we have walked through HTML, so how to structure your web page, the different pieces of a web page that you use HTML to kind of lay out. And we have enjoyed we've enjoyed our animal references throughout, and so we're going to continue that trend today. We're actually going to be using animal emojis today. I was kind of thinking about our tradition of having sort of a fun fact at the beginning of the stream, and so I'm thinking about emojis that I use a lot and emojis that I kind of feel like represent me. We were actually just talking before the stream about my own Twitch channel, and one of the emojis that my subscribers can use is a little tiny version of me kind of adjusting my glasses like this. And that's also the emoji that I think about a lot. It's kind of like a raised eyebrow. What about you, Marcy?
Yes, I've thought about this a lot. It sort of varies by the week. This week, I would say I'm probably the avocado emoji because I'm now a developer advocate, which we like to call developer avocado. So if you see that, developer plus avocado, that's what that is. So that's what I'm going with.
Nice. I like that. Quick refresher in case anybody is new or you maybe didn't have time to walk through things in between sessions. We are using Glitch to kind of walk through and code, and also to preview our code over here on the right of my screen. I'm able to preview the code as I'm editing it. If you're new to Glitch, you can hit the layout. You can hit the link in the stream in the chat, and you'll see our sort of completed project for today. You can remix that by going to Glitch, clicking in the top left. It should be the name of the project, and you can click on Remix Project, and from there you'll be able to kind of copy that over to your own account on Glitch, and you can remix it and edit as you like. That's your copy that you can move forward with and play around. Welcome back to Owly Pixel. Nice to see you again. Awesome. Cool. So today we're going to be talking about how to lay out a page. We have this really awesome cats and dogs page that Marcy has filled with her pets, which I love.
The cat is across the room, and I'm really wishing she would come join us.
Well, hopefully we'll have a special guest pop by. It's really up to Bagley, as it is with all cats, I think. They kind of do what they want.
Can't force greatness.
And she is pretty great. Like that's a majestic cat.
Well, I'm really curious to see how you'll adjust this page to have more of a curated layout, depending on what size of monitor you're viewing this page, all different factors that you could style this so that it's not one long column, but on wider screens have things sit next to each other. So yeah, I'm so curious how you're going to do this today.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we we have this really great flexible, in terms of width, page. So no matter how wide I pull this, our kitties are going to stretch out to the width of our page. And I can pull this out. Bagley only gets so wide, but the page, the container that Bagley is in, is going to take up the whole width, and so on throughout. And we can alter this. We can adjust so that our elements on our page are a little more responsive, so that we get a different layout when we're on this wide screen versus when we're on a smaller screen, like a tablet or a cell phone even. So yeah, we're going to use something called Css Grid in order to achieve that. So to kind of demonstrate this a little bit, we are going to talk a little bit about what it means to have a grid-based layout, and so that we can kind of visualize that. And we're going to use emojis to do it. So let's get started. When we talk about a grid-based layout, imagine something like a tic-tac-toe board. So you have lines both vertically and horizontally. And those lines create this sort of container for your elements on your page. And so in our case, we don't really have that. We don't have that grid layout yet. We sort of have this blob that everything kind of goes in order, the same order that we have our HTML in. So this main element here is the main content in our page. And that's broken into two sections. So I have my kitty section and my doggos section. And so those appear on the page in order. But what we can do here is wrap these sections in a grid container, and that will allow us to get a little more flexible. Ooh, and welcome to our friend from Costa Rica. That's awesome. Thanks for hanging out with us. All right, so I'm going to come over to our CSS, and I am going to make some changes to our main element to kind of show what we can do. And then we'll break it down and get a little more specific about the different properties that we're going to use. So over here in my main, I'm going to add a new display property. So I'm selecting my main element. So that's the element that is encompassing the main content of my page. I'm going to use the name of that element as my selector. And then I'm going to choose the display property. That's the property of the main element that I'm going to alter. I'm going to change that display property, and I'm going to give it a value of grid.
Hey, Aisha, can you zoom in on your browser window a little?
I can totally do that. Do I know how to do that on a... Yes, yes, I do. How is that? Let us know in the chat if that is a little easier to read.
Yeah, and you could see the browser window respond as you made that change on your keyboard. That was pretty cool. It was a flexible site.
Yeah, it's awesome. So I did that with Control Plus on a Windows computer. You could do that with Command Plus on a Mac.
Handy trick.
Absolutely. Awesome. So our main now has a display of grid, and that is going to allow us to use these CSS Grid properties on our grid container and its children. So we talked in previous sessions about how our HTML document is kind of like a family tree. And so you'll hear a lot of people talk about the elements on a web page like family members. So if our main is kind of where we're starting off, and it has descendants, just like your grandma or grandpa or whoever has descendants, you're their you're their descendant. So our sections then are going to be siblings, and those sections are what we are going to call our grid items. So we have our main as the grid container and our sections as grid items. So over here, I am going to change this main element so that over in Animal Friends, we are able to get two of our grid items, our sections, on the screen at the same time. So to do that, I'm going to come over here and I am going to define the columns in my grid. I'm going to create a grid template columns. And so this property is going to define the columns in my grid. I'm going to give that, let's see, I'm going to give that 2 columns. And we can already see something happening. Now I've used a unit here that we haven't talked about before. This is a fractional unit, that FR. And that means that I'm taking up a unit of the remaining space. So if I have 2 columns, and I'm defining 2 separate columns here, so 1, 2, each of those is going to take up an equal amount of space because they have the same number here. So they're each taking up 1 fractional unit. Since there are 2 of them, that means each takes up 50%. I could change this to, say, 2 fractional units. And so now it's a little easier to see on a wider screen. But if I switch back over to our wider screen, we can see that our doggos is now taking up 2/3 to the kitties 1/3. So I have a total of 3 fractional units. Kitties has 1, doggos has 2.
That's so cool because it would be flexible. Like you're not hard coding in a width for those columns. So they keep this size relationship, like a ratio. That is so cool.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a lot of fun. All right. Yeah, and absolutely. Caitlin or Marcy, someone in the chat brings up a really good point. We are absolutely always happy to answer questions. So please feel free to drop questions in the chat as you feel them, as they come up. And I'm happy to stop. Marcy will absolutely jump in if she sees something that she thinks we should answer in the moment. I'm gonna just move.
I have one actually. I was
Awesome.
going to ask you, Aisha, what is the default display property? So you added display grid.
Yeah.
What was the default before you changed it?
Yes, excellent question. So by default, a lot of our elements are going to have a display of block. And so I'm actually not sure if we talked about display. I think we did a little bit, display versus inline elements. So by default, and I'm going to comment this out with Control/ for a second here. And that's Command/ on a Mac. So by default, these container elements have their own lines. And so those are our block level elements. They automatically take up the full width of the page of their containers or their parents, and they get their own line. So anything that comes after this section, which is another section in this case, gets its own line. It comes down to the next. And it's the same with our footer here. So after our section ends and our footer begins, which we can see in the HTML, right after our section and our main end, our footer begins, and we get this new element on its own line. And that all happens without us styling anything. In contrast, we also have something called inline elements. So that's something like a span or an image. So an image will come in alongside or in line with the element before it. And that will continue until you get to the end of a page or the end of a line, and then you'll come down to the next. So sort of like text. Your words, just like inline elements, are going to continue until they get to the edge of their container, and then they'll start on the next line. All right. Awesome.
Grid is magical.
It really, really is. And I suppose I don't lay out a lot of web pages. There are lots and lots and lots of things that you can do in web development, lots of specialties you can have, and I don't lay out a lot of pages. So it's kind of nice to play around with Grid and see how powerful it is. You can really do a lot with not a ton of elements, not a ton of properties.
That's so cool. Yeah, it's worth pointing out that no matter where you are in your journey of learning web development, there's always new things that you can learn, and especially every few years when there's new technologies that come out. So you could be a senior staff software engineer like Isha and still have this this hunger and kind of curiosity to learn new things, and that's one of the coolest parts of web development, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. It is so much fun, and there's always something new to learn, some new either new technology or just something that's new to you that you can explore. So that's awesome. We can also play around with the gaps in between these elements. So you can see these are because they have those rounded corners, and Marcy did that with let's see if I can find here we go. So we've got our section selector, and we've added this border radius, which is what's giving us those rounded corners. So because we have those rounded corners, we can see the edges of these elements, but we can actually add some space in between them using the grid gap property. I can add some amount of space in here. I could do something like, I can use the rems that we've used kind of throughout. So let's say I add a rem of space in between. And so now I have this very even gap between my elements, which is really nice. Awesome. Cool. So that's kind of an intro. We can do a whole lot with Grid. We can actually set ourselves up to repeat these columns. We can make them a little more flexible, and we'll get into that. But for now, I want to add some individual grid items. I want to play around with some new content. I think we're going to get to those. I think we're going to get to those emojis I alluded to before. I'm going to make a new section. And in that section, I think I am going to add some new animal friends. This is going to be kind of a collection. So my H3, which is my heading, just like kitties and doggos, I'm just gonna call that other animal friends for now. So after my doggos section, I've created a new section. I've given that section an H3 inside and added other animal friends as my title for that new section. And so that has appeared on my screen, and I've got, in addition to its normal, that's probably margin, it's also got that grid gap that I set on the whole grid. So in here, I want to list out some animals. Let's say that I have, this is actually we want that to be an H2, the same level as our kitties and doggos. And in here, let's say we actually wanted to have like a carnivores section. And in here,
it's interesting how you added that item and it goes like in the same column as that first section. Some grid magic happening there.
There is absolutely some grid magic. So because I set my columns, and here we'll actually go back over to this. So because we set our grid columns in here, I've defined 2 columns. So we have 2 columns, and the first one takes up 1/3 of the space, and the second takes up 2/3. And so as I add new sections to our grid, we are they're gonna slot themselves into those columns. I haven't defined any rows, and so I'm just going to have as many rows as I have based on the number of grid items. But we do have some rules around our columns, and so we're gonna conform to those rules as we add new sections.
Yes, and we did have one comment in the chat from Todd Libby about hoping that the Chrome browser will implement subgrid sometime soon. And so that's a future version of CSS Grid that would allow you to have grids within grids. Bit of a gridception thing, but it's pretty new, so not quite there yet. But Grid is a new technology, and there are improvements coming to it, as time goes by.
Yeah, that's really, really exciting. So I'm actually going to come over to I cheated a little bit, and I've already got our carnivores grid ready. I'm going to add this unordered list, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what's in it. So over here, I have an unordered list of carnivores. So that's our UL element. And my unordered list has 2 classes. It has a grid class and a carnivores class. And we're going to use those classes in our CSS. That is going to give us something that we can kind of grab onto aside from the element itself. So over in our CSS, in the same way that we used this clip text class in a previous session, we're gonna hone in on that grid class that we added by using that period and then the name of the class.
That makes a lot of sense, because then your unordered lists, which you may not want them to be grid styled, that gives you a hook to style a specific type of list on a grid.
Absolutely. So we can kind of watch the unordered list on the side here in our preview as we style our grid class to kind of make sure that it's doing what we think it should be doing. So right now, we've got the automatic unordered list styles. We have those little bullet points, and everything's going straight down. But what we want to end up with is like a little gallery of animal emojis. So to do that, we are going to focus on some unordered list styles that we want to change, and then we are going to dive into the grid. So on an unordered list, we can affect the list style. And I'm going to get rid of it for now. So this is how you would change your bullet points. So actually, off the top of my head, I don't remember any of the other elements. I think you can, or any of the other values. I think you can use disk. I might be making that up. I probably am. Marcy, do you remember?
There are a few list style types, including disk, circle, square, decimal leaning 0, lower Roman, upper Roman, lower Greek. So you could style them to look like an outline depending on how nested your lists are. You could create something that had, numbers maybe, and then disks for the bullets under those items. Yeah, you can get pretty fancy with your list styling.
Sweet. Yeah. So if I change this to square, for example, they move from circles to squares, and that makes sense if you're laying something out like that, and you want to get really specific with how those bullet points look. But for us, we actually don't want them to show up at all, because we're gonna change up this list quite a lot. We are also going to get rid of some padding that gets applied to this list automatically. Now you'd be able to figure out how to affect this list in your own work by right-clicking, or you can control-click on a Mac and inspecting that element. So over here, we can see that our unordered list, if we highlight it, and I can also make that a little bigger. How about that? So you can see that our unordered list gets this padding of 40 pixels. That's the units in here you can generally assume are pixels. But it has a padding on the left of 40. And so I can get rid of that if I don't want my unordered list to have padding at all, which is this space between my emojis and the edge of their container right now. I can get rid of that padding by adding this padding property and setting that to 0. So now they're all the way over to the left of their container. And I also want this grid class to have a display of grid. So we're going to use that same display property. We're going to set it to grid. And then we're going to define our grid for our emojis. So I'm going to say grid template columns, just like before, and I'm going to define the columns for this emoji grid. And for this, I think we are going to have 3, well, let's do 3 columns. So now we have 3 columns, have 3 emojis each, all with that one property value pair. And just because I want to give these a little more definition, I'm going to add a grid gap, which we'll be able to see later. And that one, let's give it half of a rem. All right, so we'll be able to see that when we style our individual list items. So over on my HTML document, each of these list items has a class of grid item. So I can use that grid item class to style those list items specifically. So over here, again, it's a class, so I'm going to use that period and then the name of the class. And for this, I'm going to set a background color so that we can kind of see the dimensions of each individual list item. So let's give that a background color. You do have to spell the word background correctly. And I mentioned this before, but I really, really like salmon. I like salmon as a food, but I also really like the color.
It's a good color.
It's a great color. So I'm going to add salmon. I am also going to add a font size. I'm going to make our emojis a little bigger. Let's try triple the base size here. So now these emojis are huge. And so these are going to look a little different depending on your operating system. So if you are using a Windows computer, I guess this is what the emojis look like. If you're using a Mac, they're going to look like the the iOS emojis that you're used to seeing. It just depends on your system. So don't worry if your tiger looks a little different than mine. Let's see. We're also going to let's call it there. I think this is looking pretty good. There are some pretty cute animals going on over here. So that looks good. And because we added that grid gap of half a rem, we can see there is a gap between these individual elements.
And it does look like tic-tac-toe now, except it's a grid of carnivores.
It does. Well, so what we can do is we can add some herbivores to kind of tone it down a little bit. How about that? And note, if we come over here to our large screen, those carnivores are kind of shifted over to the side. So for us, let's maybe add one more thing. We'll add text align. So these emojis, these are text that are sitting within our list items, and so we can use text align and give it a value of center. And now because the screen is a little smaller, a little narrower, it's not as easy to see. But when we come over here to our widescreen, we can see that our emojis are now centered in their containers.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of the oversized emoji.
As am I.
Because you can see so much more detail. They're really cute.
They are.
And apparently a standard. So if you really geek out on emoji, you could like do that professionally, like make more emoji happen.
That's really awesome. So I'm going to come over here and cheat mostly because I have given each of these list items individual classes so that we can kind of play around with them. So over here in my HTML, I'm going to copy and paste another H3, and this H3 has the herbivores heading. So I've got my carnivores and I've got my little herbivores now as well. We got a mouse, a hamster, a bunny. They're all very cute. And I've got another unordered list. That unordered list also has a class of grid, and so that's how that grid and those grid item classes on each of our list items, that's how we've automatically got that styling. We didn't have to do anything else. We gave them those classes, which we've already sort of defined in our CSS. So anything with these classes is going to get that same styling that we defined earlier. So over in our HTML, in addition, now each of these list items has this ID. So I can hone in on that individual element using that ID, and I can give it its own styling. So over here in our CSS, I can then, for one thing, I could potentially completely ignore those IDs, and I could look at the herbivore class. So if I said herbivores and then grid item, I'm selecting an element with the class grid item that is a descendant of or inside of an element with the class of herbivores. And so in here, for example, I could change the background color to, I don't know, green. And if I did that, then only my herbivores would have a green background. And my carnivores, even though I didn't say anything about carnivores in my initial styling, they would keep that sort of default background color of salmon because they do still have this grid item class, but they're not inside of anything with the herbivores class. All right, so let's kind of play around with individual elements, individual grid items. We have sort of let them fall where they will, but you can define where a grid item starts and ends. And we can do that by adding grid column start. So let's look at the bunny. I like bunnies. So I'm going to select the individual bunny element or bunny emoji using its ID. So I use a hashtag. A fun word for that is an octothorpe. I really like that word. And then
part at Octothorpe.
hashtag number symbol, those work too.
Yep.
And then the name of the ID. And so now I've got hashtag bunny, and that is my selector. It is specifically referencing the list item with my bunny emoji in it. And so in here, I can define a starting column. So I can say grid column start, and then let's say I add 1. Now, notice that my bunny has moved. The numbers that you give as values for grid column start and some similar properties that we're going to look at in a second are using the number of the sort of grid lines that your grid container is made up of. So our first grid column line is all the way to the left of our grid. And then each column, in between each column is another column line all the way to the end of your grid. So in our case, we have a 3-column grid, which means we have 4 column lines. Let's actually look at our mouse real quick. So I'm going to change that ID that I'm looking at. So my grid column start is 1 right now. I can change the grid column end. And by default, it's taking up a single column. But I can change the grid column end to 4. And now our mouse takes up the whole width of the grid. I can change that to 3. And it'll only take up 2 columns. And if I change it to 2, then we're back to that default. It's because it's the first element in our grid, it's automatically taking up that first spot in the top left, which is essentially what we've outlined here. So let's. I'll give this a span of 3. How about that? I can also change the rows that our elements take up. So if I say grid row start 1, again, nothing changes because that is for this particular element where it would end up anyway if we are letting our elements kind of fall in the order in which they're written. I can change the grid row ends. And if I change this from where it's kind of hanging out at 2 to let's say 3, again, now our mouse is taking up a 2x2 section of our grid. And again, you can change this to whatever you like. This could be, here we go, 4 and then a semicolon, and it'll take up 3 rows and so on.
That is magical.
It is so cool. I can't tell you how much time I truly don't know how much time I've spent trying to do something like this and sort of moving things around and doing math. There's a lot of math for a while.
Yeah, the browser is doing a lot of math for you behind the scenes, which is so powerful.
Absolutely.
And if you had different kinds of content, imagine if you were laying out a magazine or like when I was a kid, a printed newsletter where I would talk trash about my family. The online version of that, you could have content, maybe photos or different pieces of content that form this really neat laid out grid that you can define. And if you wanted to, say, switch to a right to left language where you start reading from the right of the screen and go left instead of Western languages, how we start reading on the left side of the screen, you can actually flip that much easier using something like CSS Grid, which is amazing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Cool. Let's play around a little bit. So we've kind of taken 4 lines to describe this this area for our mouse. We do have a couple of shorthand properties that we can play with as well, and these are combinations of these more specific properties like grid column start, grid column end. So for example, let's go back to the bunny. Poor bunny was neglected. Let's give the bunny, let's use a grid column. So for example, I could bring my bunny down to let's say the 3rd row. And so I could say grid column, and I'm going to give it a value to start, and then I am going to say, that's column. I'm going to give it a value to start, and then I'm going to say that it spans 2 columns. And so now our bunny is taking up 2 columns. So versus using grid column start and grid column end and defining the endpoint, I'm saying start at column line 1 and span 2 columns. I can also give it a row. So I can say grid row. And if I want it to keep that single row, I can say grid row start and give that 3. And then our mouse kind of goes back to where it was as well. All of these are going to relate to each other, and so they'll move around a bit depending on what you've set for each individual more specific elements. And our zebra's looking kind of lonely, so we can use kind of the same idea to move our zebra, and we'll at least give him center stage. So I can add a grid column start in here, and if I want to give my zebra the 2nd column all to itself, for example, I could say grid column start 2. I could also use this same grid column and give it a span of 3. So let's say 1/span 3. And now he gets the whole row all to himself.
That is awesome. We had a comment in the chat about, well, we've had a few. I'm waiting to address some of it until a little bit later, but we did have a comment about from G. Jacoby83 says, I guess when we say subgrid style, it makes me think of a grid within a grid. I know I've done something like that with Material UI, which is a UI library that you could pull in to get extra code that you could use to style pages. They said, I can't speak to which would be easier to use. I think the benefit of CSS Grid is that you get it for free in browsers that support it, so you don't have to download any extra files. You don't have to learn another way, like another framework language. You can learn CSS Grid, and your users can benefit by not having to download those extra library files. So there's pros and cons. Material UI may have pre-existed CSS Grid, so those tools have been really useful in the past to give us more functionality. And as things in the browser become more native and more available, like CSS Grid, you really can't go wrong. It's pretty great either direction.
That's true, for sure. All right, so we've done some fun things. If we look back over at our large screen, our wide screen, we can see that all of the rules that we set for our grids are holding strong. Our mouse, even if the individual columns get a little wider with a wider screen, we still have the same proportions. We still have the same relationships between those elements. Let's play around a little bit more and look at our grid itself. So right now, we very explicitly have a single, or rather two columns. One takes up a single fractional unit and another takes up two fractional units. So we have a total of three, and our first column takes up 1/3, second column takes up 2/3. Now that works if we always want to have two columns at 1/3 and 2/3. So that's not always going to be the case. So we can do something kind of fun and use this repeat function in our grid code. So I'm going to use first this grid template columns as an example. So because this is a little bit simpler. So in here, I've said one fractional unit, one fractional unit, one fractional unit 3 times. And I don't need to repeat those fractional units. I can say repeat, and then open my parentheses, and then I can give the number of times I want to repeat, which in this case is 3, and then the unit I want to repeat. Then close my parentheses. So I have repeat, open parentheses, 3, comma, 1 FR, close parentheses, and then my semicolon. And now my grid looks the same. I still have a 3x3 grid because I have 9 elements, but I have cut down on my repeating code. And instead, I'm using this repeat function, and now I can change how many times I repeat. I can make this 4 columns. I can make it 6 columns. And I don't have to repeat myself. I don't have to keep writing 1 FR for every column to represent every column. That's pretty cool. We can also use this same repeat on our larger grid, the one that we set on our main element. So over here, I'm gonna get a little funky, and I am going to use repeat again. This is again for the whole main element, but this time I want to be a little more flexible in the number of times I repeat. And I can do that using autofit. So this is a keyword that is going to let me change the number of times that my columns repeat. So in this case, I'm going to say autofit, comma, auto-fit, comma. Then I'm going to use another function, min-max, open my parentheses, and I'm going to give a minimum width. I'm going to say 360 pixels, comma, 1 FR, so 1 fractional unit, and then close my parentheses again. And now, if I look at my widescreen, this is a little easier to see. Now, because I've got a pretty wide screen, I can see 3 different columns on the screen at the same time. They each have more than 360 pixels to them, and so I can see all 3 of them on the screen at once. Now, if I were to make this a little smaller, I'm going to see if I can grab the edge of my screen, I can move these, and as they get smaller, I see, yeah, that's exciting. I'm gonna actually use this window. So we can pick up where we left off, and now we have 2 columns, and then a third. And as this gets narrower, now I've got 1 section per row. And it just depends on the total width available to them. So they're going to try to take up the same amount of space. But if that leaves them with less than 360 pixels each in width, then they're going to move down to the next line. And so now that we're kind of below that threshold, they're each on their own lines. And so this becomes a little more flexible, a little more responsive. All right. So
we had a great, there's a resource that Arnold Delacruz shared in the chat for a good reference cheat sheet for CSS grids. It is grid.malven, malven.co.
Ooh.
Pretty awesome. And I also shared the resources from our completed project on Glitch in the README file. There are 2 resources. Well, there's 3, I believe, but the 2 related to CSS Grid. There is a reference on CSS tricks and Grid Garden, which is a fun game to learn CSS Grid.
Yes, absolutely. So this is listed as a complete guide to Grid, and it will walk you through each of the properties that we talked about and more. And over on Grid Garden, cssgridgarden.com, you can actually play a game to practice these different properties. So you're watering carrots and you're getting rid of weeds, and it's a lot of fun. And it's a really good way to practice. If you're interested in Flexbox, which I know a couple of folks in the chat mentioned, these are the same people, I believe, that made another game called Flexbox Froggy, and you can access it through that same link.
Flexbox Froggy is awesome.
It's super
we did
fun.
get some comments and questions about Flexbox. So maybe just a quick explainer of what Flexbox is and how, why would you choose Grid versus Flexbox?
Yeah. So when we talk about Flexbox, so this is another way to lay out our elements, but it's really kind of meant to be in one dimension at a time. Sorry, we've got some crashing in the background. So when you're choosing Grid versus Flexbox, you want to think about kind of what is the end goal. So your grid is going to kind of by default be defining things in vertically and horizontally, which you can do in using Flexbox. But if we're talking about kind of larger collections of things, I would probably go with Grid. I'm sure Marcy has a little more refined explanation, but that's kind of what I'm going with.
Well, I know for my own website, I used Grid to lay out the layout for the page so that it had columns, a design kind of like you would see in a magazine. And then my navigation, there's a row of links across the top to various pages. And those I used Flexbox because they don't need to really fit on a grid. They don't have uniform widths or anything. They just sort of flow in a line. And then when the browser window is narrower, they flow onto the next line, or however I've styled them to respond to different sizes. But you can use Grid and Flexbox together.
True.
And it's really about like your group of carnivores and herbivores. They fit nicely onto that tic-tac-toe board where you really want to control where all of the items go as a unit. And then with Flexbox, maybe if you didn't care about them wrapping down to the next line, depending on how many items there are or how big the screen is. So they're 2 slightly different techniques, but they're both awesome and you can use them together.
For sure. Yeah. That was a great explanation. Thank you. All right, awesome. So we have a few more minutes. If there are any questions in the chat, anything else that you want to talk about, feel free to drop them in. In the meantime, we did have one more bonus thing to talk about. So over here, when we look at the mouse, let's return to our mouse friend real quick. So we've used 4 different properties to define this area that the mouse takes up, but we actually have a shorthand property that we can use to do that. and it is called Grid Area. So,
look who came. Our special guest.
oh my goodness. Oh my
it's
goodness.
The Miss Bagley herself.
Look at that. Look at
Here
that.
she is. We finally have a guest in week 3.
Oh, perfect.
Might even be able to hear her purring.
She knows she's in the spotlight. It's pretty great.
It looks like we got a question from Todd Libby. They ask, will place dash items : center work on the mouse to center it both horizontally and vertically?
Ooh.
Let's try it. So my answer to that kind of question is almost always let's try it. So if I say place items center, then it does not. And there is actually a note. I think I may have put it in the notes, but other sort of I want to call them arrangement properties are not going to work on grid items. And I don't know if that explicitly includes place items, but
Well, you might need to, let's see, that's on the individual grid item. Maybe if you put it on the grid class, since all of them you're placing all of the items. So in both Flexbox and Grid, kind of what got it to click for me is thinking about containers versus items. And so some of the properties work on the containers, and then some of them work on the items. There is a complete guide to Flexbox on CSS Tricks. I'll dig up the link. But that one, they have kind of side by side what applies to a container, what applies to an item. And that is finally what clicked for me. Let me go find that.
Yeah, I think that is. Oh, I think that's in our README. Oh, this is last week's version. But if you go to the
I know
perfect, you got it in the chat. And if you go to the README for this week, you'll also find that same link. So this has centered our mouse. The only thing is now the element itself is centered, and it is squished to fit its contents. So now our individual elements are only as big as the text inside of them, which may be what you want. It may not be, and it kind of, you'll then have to do some more work if you want to keep your sort of defined areas for each of your elements.
We had one more comment in the chat from Todd Libby, I believe, that his go-to is to experiment with layouts over at Rachel Andrews' site, gridbyexample.com.
Ooh, Rachel Andrews. Rachel Andrews' stuff is great.
Yeah, she is a leading person in the CSS Grid space, her and Jen Simmons, and I've learned so much from both of them. Really cool to learn. Yeah, CSS Grid by example.
This
Great
is awesome.
suggestion.
Very, very cool. Yeah, absolutely. And when she speaks about anything CSS related, I listen. It's really, really, really great. Definitely go and follow Rachel Andrew on Twitter, on wherever you follow people if you want to know more. Awesome. So I'm gonna follow up with our grid area example, and then I think we're gonna have to close it out. If we so we can use this as a shorthand for the 4 properties that we have. So our row start is going to be our first value, and then we're going to add a slash, then column start, which in our case is also 1, another slash, and then we're going to do row end, column end. So row end is 3, and column end is also 3. and then we're going to finish with that semicolon. So now I can get rid of my four other properties that I've set on this element: grid column start, grid column end, grid row start, and grid row end. And if I get rid of those, our mouse stays in its place because we've used this grid area shorthand to replace those four properties. So that is what we have for you today. I really hope you enjoyed it and learned some things. And thank you so much, Marcy, Caitlin, and Mike for captioning.
Yeah, thanks, Mike.
Bagley.
And Bagley.
Special appearance by Bagley.
Yep.
Yeah. And if you don't already follow us on Twitch, now is a great time to do that. And we'll be back with another episode of Gatsby Web Creators next Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. Yeah, and I don't know if you want to say a couple words about what we'll be looking at then, Aisha or Marcy.
Yeah, so we're going to continue the CSS train, but we are going to actually be talking a little bit about CSS animations next week.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again to everybody, and we hope you have a great weekend and see you next week.
Yes, and probably some media queries.
Also media queries.
All right. Thanks, everybody.